Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm delighted to be here with all of you tonight, wherever you're watching from around the world, to celebrate A Quilt for David with the author Stephen Rains and with our interviewer and conversation partner Carter Sickels, who has been at Charis many, many times and who is a friend and someone whose work I'm a big fan of. So I invited Carter to be here tonight because his work, though he is a fiction writer, is in many ways in conversation with the time period and some of the themes of Stephen's book. So I'm going to introduce Carter first and then introduce Stephen, and then I'll get out of the way and let these two folks start digging in. But Carter is the author most recently of The Prettiest Star, which was published by Hub City Press and winner of the 2021 Southern Book Prize and the Weatherford Award. The Prettiest Star was also selected as a Kirkus Best Book of 2020 and a Best LGBT Book of 2020 by O Magazine. His debut novel, The Evening Hour, came out from Bloomsbury in 2012. It was an Oregon Book Award finalist and a Lambda Literary Award finalist. It was adapted into the feature film that just recently premiered at Sundance. And his essays and fiction have appeared in a variety of publications, including The Atlantic, Oxford American, Poets and Writers, BuzzFeed, Joyland, Guernica, Catapult, and Electric Literature. Carter is the recipient of the 2013 Lambda Literary Emerging Writer Award and earned fellowships from the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Swanee Writers Conference, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, as well as McDowell. He is currently an assistant professor of English at Eastern Kentucky University, but is enjoying his sabbatical right now. So very glad that you can be with us.
Thank you.
The person of the hour tonight is Stephen Rains, who is the author of Inheritance, as well as Your Dead Body is My Welcome Mat. He's lectured and taught writing workshops around the country to LGBTQ plus youth, seniors, and people living with HIV. Rains worked for a decade as an HIV test counselor in Florida and Los Angeles, and currently he is touring The Gay Rub, an exhibition of rubbings from LGBTQ plus landmarks around the world, and has a private practice as a psychotherapist. He lives in West Hollywood, California, and the book we are here to celebrate tonight is A Quilt for David. So we want to let folks ask questions at any time. So you can put your question in the Ask a Question box at the bottom center of the screen, or put it in the chat, and I'll be sure to move it over where it will get seen by Carter and brought into the conversation at the right time. But folks can also let us know where you're watching from. We saw Cleo. Hey, Cleo. And if other folks want to say hi and shout out how you know Stephen or how you know Carter or anything else that you want to say, we love for you to be chatty in the chat. So I'm going to get out of the way. Thank you both so much for being here. We are really delighted to have this conversation at Charis virtually tonight.
Hi, Stephen. It's so good to be here with you. And congratulations on your book. It's really beautiful. It's a really beautiful book. And I'm really honored to be here with you and to be at Charis, even if it's virtually. Do you want to start with a reading and then?
Sure.
Or do you want to, I guess we should figure that out first. Or do you want me to ask questions first?
Oh yeah, I could just, I imagine people who are tuning in know a little bit about the book, but I would just start by, for those who don't know, the book is about a real incident that took place in 1991 in the small town of Stuart, Florida. Also the town Jensen Beach was part of it, so it's known as the Treasure Coast of Florida. It's where 8 people came forward and accused their then dead dentist of giving them HIV. And so for 10 years, I researched and wrote about this situation, and this book is a product of that. And it's an exploration of what really happened in that dental office. So the main character, the person I focus on is the dentist himself. His name is David Acer. And he's on the cover of the book. And, oh, it's also behind me. You can see his face behind me. So yeah, I'll start with so one of his accusers was on the cover of People magazine, and his other accusers were on tabloid talk shows, and he was really vilified in the public. So I wrote this kind of mid-research when investigating David's life, and it's actually the poem that the title comes from. It's an allusion to the AIDS quilt. I'd sew for you. I would grab a needle, put the thread in my mouth, moisten the fibers together. I'd pierce into the eye. I'd hem, backstitch, side stitch, a remembrance of you. I'd put your name in large letters, wanting no one to forget you died of it too. I'd sew you into that larger quilt because no one else has. I'd select patterns, design a quilt representing your lifelong loves. Kimberly has 4 panels, photos, and a large starfish. I'd sew for you, thimble on my thumb, push the threaded needle through the fabric. If I were to prick my finger and bleed, I wouldn't regret a single drop of blood or effort.
It's so beautiful. Thank you. You know, one of the, and I would love for you to read more. Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions and you can read some more from it. It's just, it feels like such a profound and kind of urgent book. And like you said, it is about Dr. David Acer, but it also, I thought, really captured the failures of this country during the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, and like the deep and pervasive homophobia, which was the norm, right? And the accusers, the media, politicians turned him and so many gay men and so many people with AIDS into this monster, and that's how he was remembered. And so you, I think what you do so well is you interrogate those accusations and you really, you know, lift him up as this human being. And I want to get into this a little bit more later, but I think that you showed how easy it was for people to believe the words of a white straight woman, this avowed virgin, over the words of a gay man, because so many of society did not, you know, want gay men to even sort of exist, right? And you write about him with such compassion and empathy. And so I wanted to sort of start with the impetus for writing the book. In your preface, you mentioned remembering seeing this episode of A Current Affair, I think, where a dentist was accused of infecting his patients. And so you were, I think, in the 8th grade. And if you could talk a little bit more about that memory, maybe even how it impacted you then, but then also why this particular story really compelled you, like what led you to wanting to write this book?
Yeah, it's so in the 8th grade after school, I had a ritual of eating saltine crackers while watching tabloid television shows. And I think the reason those shows appealed to me is because it was the only place I would see gay content. And usually it was about like gay strip clubs or you know, something kind of salacious, but as a young boy, knowing that I was different and knowing that I was gay, it was problematic representation, but it was the only representation I was aware of. And it was on one of those tabloid shows that I saw Kimberly Bergalis. And she said how she was, she had AIDS and she was infected by her dentist. The dentist, for myself as well as anyone else, has never been the most pleasurable of experiences. So it just kind of made the dental experience even scarier. At the time, I believe dentists had the highest suicide rate in our country. It was really scary, the disease that I thought I was maybe destined for as a gay man, that even by not participating, by not living openly gay, like if that wasn't going to happen for me, there was still an opportunity for me to become infected. It was a very scary story. And I think a story that I just kind of pushed aside and, came out quite young, and I had a fake ID. So at the age of 16, I was going to gay bars. A lot of my friends were older gay men then. So I had an awareness around AIDS and HIV and the complications. I had an ex-boyfriend die at an early age, and then one of my best friends was really sick, and that was in 1999, 98 or 99. And for a brief time, I tried to be his caregiver, and I was so unprepared for that task. And it was devastating for me. I mean, I was so young, right? And a lot of people were, and I admire the people who were able to just to like push through. But for me, it wasn't an option, and so other people cared for him. And after he died, it was a kind of shook my world up a little bit, and I think I just kind of figured that the calmest part is in the center of the storm. And so I soon got a job working in the HIV field, and that was doing HIV testing and counseling and education. So I was living in Florida, actually on the directly opposite of where Kimberly and David lived. So I was in Tampa, Florida. They were on the other coast. And so I worked in that field for 10 years and learned, of course, a lot about HIV. I was certified by the health department in Florida, and then later on the health department in Los Angeles to provide education and counseling. And one day at work, I remembered the story of the dentist. And I thought, how did that happen? What happened? And so that's how my research started.
I had, I was also watching those same sort of shows. And I've talked about this a little bit, but for my book, The Prettiest Star, I remembered this episode of Oprah. I used to watch Oprah every day after school. And this gay man who was HIV positive was on, and he lived in a small town in West Virginia, and he had been kicked out of the swimming pool.
Yes.
And they sort of drained the pool, and then Oprah went to that town, and they did this whole sort of town, like people from the town came, it was sort of this town hall, and it left it impacted me in this way, because I also didn't know any queer people. I was living in a very small town. I didn't even know that I was queer. I didn't have the language around that. Mm-hmm. And there was such like ugliness, right, from the audience, that I remember this guy standing up and saying, AIDS is nature's way of eradicating gay men. And I didn't understand why it struck me so much at the time, but it really did, so that years later, I still remembered it. And then I kind of led me into writing my book. But
yeah, and growing up different, there was always, I don't know about you, but I always felt like there was the threat of physical harm from, the people I went to school with. And so not only our queer people have that immediate threat, but then for our generation, there was that future threat of this is what we deserved and what was going to happen for us.
Right. And that fear of the rejection of your family, and your friends and society. I mean, the level of blatant homophobia and hatred of gays and queers was just so a part of our, I think, culture and society during that time. And so actually I'm going out of order now, because that makes me think of this poem that maybe you can read, but I'll describe it first. It's this really beautiful poem that struck me, where David is at the annual dentist Christmas party. Mm-hmm. And someone said, as a critique, he just stood there. That was in, I guess, public documents that you read, and as if there was something sort of wrong with that. And I think you capture so beautifully how David, like so many queer men and women, for a variety of reasons, had to stay closeted. And so, maybe you could just read that poem, and then we could talk a little bit more about it.
Sure, I'll read it, and then we can talk about it. At the Dental Society's annual Christmas party, you stood alone, watched the ice cubes melt in your plastic cup. How were you to socialize when the men in the room talked of women raising kids? there were your boating and golfing games, but there was also your gayness that could be revealed and reviled. Others would later suspiciously say how you just stood there, wanting to be a part of the crowd and not knowing how.
Thank you. I just love that poem because I feel like you entered this, you had this sort of one line to work from of what someone said about him at the Christmas party. And you enter this space with him and show, like, kind of imagine sort of what is around or underneath that comment, and that he's maybe misunderstood because he is living with this this secret, right? That he has to be closeted. And I don't know, maybe you could just talk a little bit about entering that poem, and also what the ramifications would have been for David to come out, during that time and in that place.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad you picked up on that poem. So what I found in my research was that any snippet or any bit of information that was found out about David at that time was kind of turned into something spurious, or spurious sounding, that it and any comment, whether it was a comment he made to a coworker or something someone would say about him, that it was really just, all of it became evidence of how he was a villain or a murderer or something nefarious about him. And it was so hurtful to read about this Christmas party where he, they said, like, well, he just stood there, as if that was proof that he purposefully infected people, as if that were proof that he was a murderer, as if that were proof that actually even something was wrong with him.
Right.
And just how deeply someone could be misunderstood is just, I think all of us have been misunderstood at times, and it doesn't take much for us to empathize with that. And for our jobs, I think that a lot of us have to endure social situations that we wouldn't elect on our own. And he was a young man starting a dental practice in a small town. It was probably important for him to kind of network in this way.
Yeah. And people, like you said, just sort of digging or looking for anything that they could to sort of, paint him in this negative light as something as innocuous as just standing there, right? Being awkward at a party.
And I think it also says something about the time that this was, I think that incident happened, much earlier in 87 or 88, about the same time your book, at the same time as your book. And so I think it's, in a way, it's kind of easy to forget how hated queer people were at that time, and the subtleties of that hate. Like in your book, there's a scene where they're joking around about hair, and someone's like mimicking like fairness or like effeminacy. And that took me back of, oh yeah, I remember. I think it happens less now, but those subtle ways in which we're given signals to not be ourselves and how not right we are.
Right. Yeah. Subtle ways and blatant ways. I mean, it was a time when I think to be homophobic was sort of the norm, as I was saying earlier, and the attitudes toward people with AIDS and toward AIDS and HIV was so like linked, right, or inextricably linked to homophobia. And there was this, and I think some maybe younger people, maybe in the audience, or like a lot of my students didn't know much about the AIDS crisis, and feel pretty angry and outraged about that because it was kept from them in school or by their parents, but and they want to know. But I think something that big part of your book is about is this myth of the innocent victims of AIDS. And often these were people who were infected through a blood transfusion, like Ryan White to me is one of the, sort of innocent victims. And in this case, Kimberly Bergalis was embraced as this sort of innocent victim because she was straight, she was white. She claimed that she was a virgin. And there's a statement that comes up in your book several times where she is quoted as saying, "I did nothing wrong." And then, of course, on the other side is David, who's gay, who, so by default, just did something wrong by existing, right, as a queer man. And so could you talk like a little bit more about this, especially for people in the audience who maybe didn't know about this, of why Kimberly was seen as a sort of archetype for the perfect victim? And I was thinking too, you also mentioned another one of his, you talk about another one of his accusers, Lisa Shoemaker, who wasn't believed in the same way that Kimberly was. So there's so much to talk about there that you do so beautifully in the book. But yeah, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it was almost as if people living with HIV, there was the acceptable forms of transmission and the unacceptable forms of transmission. And when working on this book, it was over and over again, for me, it was what risks do we forgive and what risks do we punish? Mm-hmm. And Kimberly, it was important for people to believe that she was a virgin. Probably very important for her parents. And also that there is that virgin archetype, right? Americans love a virgin. And so, that compared to David, who was traveling to another city to socialize and have sex with gay men. So not only is there a contrast between how those two people were talked about in the media at the time, but I think it's especially important to look at Lisa Shoemaker, who was HIV positive, does blame David Acker. And she is still living. She does education at schools. She volunteers her time to do education to kids in school. And it's interesting how these two women are portrayed. Lisa had a summer job working in a carnival, and so then she was disparagingly called a carny. And Kimberly was a waitress, but that wasn't really mentioned, And Lisa was seemingly honest about her HIV risk exposures, and Kimberly wasn't. And so it's really sad to see even how, the treatment of both of those women, both white women. Lisa was older. At the time, Lisa had gained weight. She wasn't as camera ready as Kimberly. So she wasn't as pure. It was probably less of a loss because, we're not losing a beautiful person in the world, right? So it's really horrible to, how those things were handled. And really the person kind of, I think, I see as kind of driving that was the high-powered lawyer, Robert Montgomery, who took on Kimberly's case, did not take on Lisa's case, took on two of the other people who came forward. So, I don't know, I think I'm getting lost in your question, but...
No, okay. Yeah, I was just sort of asking you to talk a little bit more about this idea of the innocent victim and how Kimberly sort of fit that archetype.
Yes.
And it also made it so much, it like having her there, right, then accusing this gay man. It was the setup that I think the media right? Kind of
Oh,
could
loved.
jump on. Yeah.
Yes, loved. And
Yeah.
you're right. There's this thing about I did nothing wrong. It's what she repeatedly said. And one thing I think is, what if no one did anything wrong, right?
Mhm.
Like David and his sexual activities, all of the other accusers and their possible modes of transmission. What if we kind of moved beyond that right and wrong?
Right. Right.
Especially at that time when so little was known.
Right. Right. I mean, it was like looking for blame, right? And that was often about people having sex or using drugs or having queer sex, I should say.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about just, again, just for kind of more information about the case and the time period and her accusation, about the effects of her accusation in politics? And I'm thinking specifically of the actions of Jesse Helms, which you write about in your book. And then I think Kimberly was there. It sounds like Kimberly was there on the floor when the House was voting on, I guess, that medical workers had to disclose their HIV status. Yeah.
So as if the $1 million from David's malpractice insurance, like Kimberly was a recipient of that, as well as I think other money from a civil case. Her and her lawyer were interested in HIV positive and a mandate that HIV positive healthcare workers disclose their status to their patients. And this would have, of course, jeopardized the livelihood of a lot of HIV positive healthcare providers. What's interesting when we think about the acceptable and unacceptable at the time modes of transmission, a lot of those healthcare, a lot of those healthcare workers could have been infected by needle sticks at the job. Right? So they were still in that like innocent category that Kimberly was in, and yet she was still advocating for something that would essentially, affect their livelihood and their jobs. Kimberly was very ill when she took a train with her parents to DC. I think in the book I say the word count. It might have been she said 33 words. I did nothing wrong. I should not be made to suffer like this, I think were some of those words. And it's, there's a whole spread in People magazine of her journey up there. And it is really sad to see those photos of this young person and the deterioration of their body. Yet it was happening to thousands and thousands of men,
right.
And it had been happening for almost a decade. So, but yet that's what the focus was on, right?
Right.
And Jesse Helms that people like David Acker should be horsewhipped.
Yeah. Such an awful person. But really, I mean, come on. It was just, again, the level of accepted sort of hate, right? And public hate of queer people. That this Jesse Helms, who had so much kind of political power at the time.
And probably his hate is the reason for said political power. Right?
Yeah. I want to give you a chance to read a couple more from the book, if you would like to do that. And then I also want to talk to you about the research that you did for this book, the investigative research. So
sure.
And also just a reminder, anyone who would like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat or the ask a question box.
So this is a poem about David Acker towards the end of his life. He stood 6 feet tall, wrestled on the high school team, played tennis and racquetball with friends, flew planes over the Gulf of Mexico, completed the rigors of dental school. His ambition was palpable, ever present. He was driven and alone, desperate at times and lonely, wanting love, and then AIDS happened. Everything he built, he was going to lose. He had been saving up for the future and realized that he might not have one. In the Palm Beach hospice, there was constant diarrhea, the thick white yeast of thrush coating his mouth and throat. On continuous oxygen, Kaposi's sores on his legs, chest, and in his lungs, a catheter inserted into his urethra. He had told his stepfather Victor he had hoped for a cure. That hope died with him for just moments before.
Thank you. It's just a powerful poem. I mean, what I love about this book too is that there's such loss and this sadness, but I think you do try to find the moments of kind of joy in his life, or what he was kind of hoping for, right? Before he became sick. And you mentioned you spent 10 years working on this book, and you accomplished an impressive amount of research, investigative research for this, all the public documents that were available. And it sounds like so much of that information was around Kimberly, that it was much more difficult to find anything on David. So it sounds like you also interviewed people. So could you talk a little bit about your process, about the research that you did?
It started, like I said, with the question of like what happened in that dental office. And the more I read, just starting like most people do, like starting with a Google search, like what happened?
Yeah.
Not getting a clear answer, but definitely understanding how much homophobia and AIDS phobia was in what I was reading. And eventually it led to, my going to courthouses and looking through courthouse documents, going to Florida several times to do research, going through the library archives, and eventually wanting to talk with people who knew David. And I put an ad in the newspaper where it's so innocent. I gave my phone number. It was just my phone number where people could call. And it was so interesting how many people called me to give me their opinion about what happened in that dental office, though they were never a patient, didn't know David Acker, and some of them didn't even live in the area at the time.
But they had a lot to tell you.
Oh, they did. Yes, they did. And although fortunately my phone did ring from people who knew him and were willing to give me information about what it was like to be his patient, about what it was like to be his friend. Eventually, I talked with one of his sex partners, which the CDC in all their investigation could not find a sex partner of David Acker's, but I did, and he described an experience they had in a hotel in Lauderdale. It was really, and for me, it helped humanize him even more. At the start of my research, I had found his mother's telephone number, and I called her, and she talked with me very briefly and said she wasn't interested in talking with anyone else. And I really, throughout the research, it was my hope to one day be able to mail her the book. And unfortunately, she passed away, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. And I think how terrible for a mom to grapple with the young death of a son, the death of a young son, and then also to have him just smeared in the public, and taking care of his estate. And so I'm sorry she she never had a chance to experience this book and my going to bat for him.
Yeah, but she knew you were, right? She knew you were working on it.
Yeah, I think, you know, the family, they were very kind to me, although ultimately not very helpful or very didn't really give much.
Mm-hmm.
And I, you know, I understand, especially how David was talked about in the media, why they do silence.
And not just sort of when Kimberly accused him, but for years after his death, right? He was still being smeared. Yeah.
Oh yeah. At one point in time, the moniker like "dentist of death" or something like that. There's even a book. The premise is that David was a serial killer. Now, is that your dog?
Can you hear?
What kind of dog?
Sorry.
I love a dog.
She's a little chihuahua shih tzu. I might have to go get her.
I'm more than welcome to be upstage with my dog. If you want to like show us your dog, how old is she?
She's 1.
Oh, just a puppy.
Yeah.
A puppy during
my
COVID.
partner is out right now, and so he's not able to like watch her. So sorry about that.
Yeah, tend to your dog. It's fine.
I'm gonna tend to my dog, and maybe you'll read for.
Sure. Okay, I'll do that. That
I'll
great.
be right back.
All right, and then I want to meet your dog. I think all of us want to. All right. So, one thing that was when we were talking about before about, let me find a poem. And this is a very short poem. A patient said, "You weren't talkative, but nice. Would go out of your way to save her office copies of People magazine. 8 months after your death, the weekly magazine's headline was about you." And this is another short poem which kind of talks about the acceptable and unacceptable ways one can be infected. Before the cocktail, when the virus kept multiplying like gremlins in the body, before full unfounded faith was put into AZT, Kimberly and Barbara were inundated with offers: lemonade, aloe, barley, yams, superheating blood treatment. People wrote, called, and dropped by unannounced. As gay men died alone in hospices, hospitals, and homes across the country, people wanted to save these 2 women.
Thank you. So I'm so sorry to interrupt with this dog.
Oh,
this is Tilly.
Kelly?
Tilly.
Oh, I love the black.
She's only 1 year old, and she's a little wild. Okay, hopefully she'll stop barking now. I had her in the kitchen. I thought maybe that would work, and it obviously didn't. But thank you for reading. So you have 2 previous collections of poems, and it makes sense that was the genre that you turned to. And the style of the book is this sort of documentary style, where, as you said, as you talked about, you did this research for these poems. And I love one of the blurbs from Richard Blanco that calls you this emotional historian, or the poet's role as this emotional historian. But can you talk about what kind of poetry offered you in writing, writing about this story, and that's different from, the nonfiction prose or journalism? And I'm also curious about all the research you did and how you compiled that, like what the process was of kind of distilling it and transforming it, this information into these poems.
Yeah. So, how did I choose poetry? I initially thought that maybe it would be a very kind of traditional nonfiction book, although poetry is the love of my life. And 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 so as I was researching, I would take notes and write, but I would write poems, really. I mean, that's what my notes would look like and my writings on it while researching. And it also seemed to suit the work itself, because poetry is the language of our emotions. And it seemed as if the belief in David's accusers was really just emotional, that there wasn't a lot of data to support that. And I thought, what if through poetry I could elicit empathy for David and really, kind of like you said, like bring people into that room of that Christmas party. What was it like to be a gay man at that time? What was it like to be David Acker, who worked so hard and had it all taken away so quickly due to AIDS? So poetry really did kind of serve a great purpose. Also, there wasn't a lot of information out there, so it was a way of kind of these kind of like patchwork poems that actually do create a quilt of sorts. And so that's how the form and that's how I found the form. I feel like there was a second part of your question.
Yeah, sort of. Were you writing as you were doing the research, or how did the poems kind of come out of the sort of this information you were getting? Which I guess there was sort of an absence of information, or with David, but still, you did 10 years of research. So how did that?
So it was a lot of Xerox copies of articles, and what I would do in those articles is I would highlight the relevant information, and I would also write in the margins. I would then put them in folders, and I would label who the information was important for. So, certain CDC investigators had their own folders, of course, all 8 different accusers. David, there was one for data, there was one for the town of Stewart, and that's how I organized the information, because it was massive. I had several folders of just the contact information of people, my trying to hunt down people. What's really challenging about that time is we did lose a lot of gay men. So the people who associated with David or would have known him, not all of them, of course, survived. Then women sometimes marry and change their names, so they're harder to track down. And so a lot of time was spent trying to track down people who worked with David, were friends with David, and that's how I used the research. And I did write as I went, and sometimes those those highlights directly are used in the book with some of the information I found. And same with my articles, my interviews, of like transcribing the interviews, taking notes during the interviews, and using those in poetry.
Was there anything, anything that comes to mind that really surprised you in your research? Anything that, someone asked me that question too, but because I was thinking, it's like I grew up, and you grew up during this time, and you were a little bit distant from it because you were younger, but then you quickly, you became part of the queer community. You lost, as you were talking about, a friend to AIDS. But I was wondering if there was any research that you did that sort of came across anything that was surprising or
more saddening than surprising. And it was heartbreaking for me to learn that Kimberly's lawyer, Robert Montgomery, who did countless interviews talking about Kimberly and advocating for Kimberly, had a son, Scott Montgomery, who died of AIDS.
Oh God, yeah.
And
that is.
And I I hope that he was treated by Robert Montgomery with the same generosity that Robert Montgomery treated Kimberly, and unfortunately, I don't believe that was the case.
That is heartbreaking. Yeah. Yeah, I think saddened versus surprised, I think is a better word for it. And I too, when I was, researching for my book, it was just so much heartbreak. But also, I think the resilience was inspiring to me of people who were fighting to be heard and seen. So I have a couple of other questions for you, but again, if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat. Do you want to read any more poems? Do you want to read any more poems?
Or I could answer a question or two while
Okay.
There's one poem I'm thinking about.
I would love to hear you read one more. Let's do one more.
And the poems are not titled. So finding them, I never realized that would be a downfall. Because locating a poem is a little bit harder. Okay. So David's office, he sold his dental practice, and can I tell a story about him selling his dental practice?
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
So he was very scared. So he was, he had a sickly appearance. He told his staff that he had cancer. He wanted to sell the practice and was afraid that people knowing that he was HIV positive or had AIDS would affect the sale of the business. And someone from a dental supply company who bought the practice from David asked, said to his face, it's rumored that you have AIDS, or people are talking and say that you have AIDS. And I don't think that comment was made out of care. I suspect that comment was like small town gossip, or it was a terrible salesman wanting to devalue David's business in order to get a better deal for it. And David replied, "I'm hopeful about my future." And I just think how violent of that man.
Yeah.
So that never got into the book. But David's office became a nightclub briefly. It's the last time I was in town, it was a casino. And so I have poems about both.
Okay.
And this poem, I use the names of all of his accusers and talk about them just briefly, but it's about that nightclub. And it's also about kind of how, like you were saying, like your students, like younger generations aren't really familiar with the complexities of that time.
Yeah.
The office where you methodically took time with patients, seeing only 8 a day, briefly became a nightclub. Club Envy had an all-ages night. Kids younger than the age of Kimberly was when she was in your chair moved on the dance floor. Young girls undid top blouse buttons as soon as their parents dropped them off, rolled up their shorts on the dance floor, sweated under black lights and mirror balls, kissed with straight white teeth, pressed their bodies together. They know nothing about history. They barely know the music the DJ spins. They'll leave the club, round the corner in the humid Florida night, smoke cigarettes in the lot where your patients parked. Maybe they'll drink from a flask that's been hidden in a young man's cargo shorts pocket. Take gulps outside the window patients once looked out from. They know nothing of you, or how hated gays were back then, or what AIDS meant at the time. They can't possibly imagine what it was like for a man trying to make a living with a deadly virus, for 8 others with a deadly virus looking for someone to blame. The young kids come every week for the music, the lights, the energy, flirtation, and the bodies moving next to them on the dance floor. Kimberly must have felt something similar at college, dancing to late 80s music with her girlfriends, flirting with men, smoking pot, tasting cocaine, maybe unbuttoning one more button from her blouse. Barbara said she was the original hippie. Did she love to dance too? John was a partier. Richard might have enjoyed a tune at the jukebox. Lisa likes her Harley and heavy metal. You went to discos in Germany and Fort Lauderdale. How drinking eased your awkwardness enough to dance and hit on men. All of you as innocent as the revelers at Club Envy. No one could have possibly known when they danced in their youth what was to come, how what they felt couldn't be bottled or kept or captured, that a virus would harm them all.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful poem. I remember reading that in the book, and it's just so moving. And I mean, history erases and silences queer and marginalized voices, and I think this book is a way to kind of resist that silencing. And as you're saying, like, so many young people, really queer young people, don't fully grasp, not to any fault of their own, what that time was like and how difficult. We do have a question from the chat, so I'm going to ask that for you, which is something that I was wanting to ask you as well. Can you say a bit about how what you learned about David's time informs your own understanding of HIV criminalization in our current time?
How did it inform things for me? I think, since I was in the field for so long, working in the field, I already knew so much. I don't know if it was if something was direct. I think it's, I think that it must feel good to blame someone else, right? And the criminalizing puts it as an outsider, not personal responsibility. And there are some modes of transmission where people do not have a, sexual assault, where there's not they don't have agency of their own. Yeah. There's also about the silencing of who gets accused of such things. I think it's probably disproportionately minorities. And I think there's something about that component of who gets to speak. And I think that these inherent biases that our culture has gets kind of played out in the criminal system, especially around issues of HIV criminalization.
Yeah. And that it's, I mean, I don't think I can add anything to that answer, but I just think about the way that, in the 80s, the way that people engaged with AIDS and with HIV and all the kind of misinformation around it and all the stigma around it, and just how that has carried on, in different ways, but we're still kind of grappling with that now. Right.
Yeah, and those ways in which, how did families respond? And in your book, there's the father who tells the grandmother, don't drink after him,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Which was so common.
Yeah.
And what kind of message does that send to the person, even when that's not even the mode? That's not a mode of transmission.
Right. And for your own father or your mother to say that, it's like the pain of that.
Yeah, and I think there's also when we talk about gay men dying, there were a lot of lesbians who really stepped up for the community.
Yeah.
And I think that's so beautiful, and I get teary-eyed thinking about it. How there really is that like strong sense of community we have as queer people or LGBTQ plus people. I also think that a lot of mothers really stepped in. Like Brian's mom in your book, as well as David's mother, who, David's mom and stepfather moved in with David to care for him towards the end of his life.
Yeah, I thought that was a really beautiful part in your book. And also, I was also thinking about Kimberly sort of holding on to this this lie, really, of that she was a virgin until the end, and like that sort of secrecy and that lie that she maintained to the very end. But then David, you write about, he did come out to his family, and that was just such a beautiful and heartbreaking kind of scene.
Yeah. And he came out because he knew he was dying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It was after a stint in he had some medical issues, and then for a year he was okay. And then symptoms came back, and that's when he disclosed to his mom. And he actually came out as being bisexual. It doesn't actually appear as if he maybe, is sometimes a way that gay men come out to kind of soften it. I don't really know. And, at the beginning of David's sickness, he was using aliases. And so he used to drive about 2 hours to Miami to go out. And then when he had symptoms, he actually took that same drive to see doctors, thinking that distance would protect him from people finding out about his illness. And he would use aliases. Then was open to his family. Everyone knew in his family. And towards the end of his life, he knew of the accusations. And then his parents and him would check him into hospice under an alias.
Right.
Yeah. So he wrote one public letter, and it was where he was stating that he discovered there are accusations against him, and he said it would be against everything he stood for, and he does not believe he was responsible or that anything happened. He also urged all of his patients to get tested. And he wrote that lying down in his hospice bed. And while he was writing that letter in his hospice bed, a different name was on the door. That letter was published 3 days after his death. And so in that moment where maybe the public could empathize with him, the next day, Kimberly's lawyer set up a press conference, and that's when Kimberly went public.
That's when she went public. Yeah. It's so horrible, and to think about his mother, enduring that, and So, I think you've written this real homage to Stephen, to David, but also to so many gay men who were forgotten or just stigmatized in this way or distorted in this way. There's so many men who didn't have a voice during that time, or who couldn't be out, or who weren't loved by their families even. So thank you for this beautiful book and the work that you put into it. And I'm going to invite ER back in, but I did want to ask you one last question, sort of shifting gears a little bit. But here's the book, by the way. And in the beginning, you have this beautiful sort of rubbing. And I read in your bio and on your website about this project, this art project that you have started. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that is, this rubbing project.
Sure. The Gay Rub is a collaborative art project where I ask people from where it's a collection from all over the world of rubbings of LGBTQ plus landmarks. And the exhibition is of those rubbings. And I think it's so powerful to see all of them displayed in one room and at one time. It's, the name is purposefully evocative. Where
it's a great name for a project.
Thank you very much. And I was so happy the website hadn't been taken yet by like a massage therapist or something. But it's, rub means social friction. He got a lot of rub for that. Rub can mean the truth. That's the rub. It could mean, it's short for rubbing, but also rub means erased, to rub something out. And I think that our queer history, for the most part, has definitely been erased when it comes to public commemorative markers. Yeah. And I want this project to help illuminate the markers in the world or in people's own hometowns. And I'm still collecting rubbings, and the project is ongoing. Yeah. And so it actually was very hard to track down David's gravesite. It's now public online. Someone submitted it. I didn't. And that was really hard. But when I found it, I thought I want to do a rubbing of David's grave marker and honor him. Yeah. And then Amy Shoulder, my editor, the great editor, Amy Shoulder, she said like, oh, hey, what if we use a rubbing of David? I mean, it was her idea. And I think it's such a beautiful way to begin and end this book. Absolutely. Yeah, it really is. So yeah, it's an incredible project, an incredible book. So thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you. I love talking with you as well. And I loved your book. And I'm so we were invited to be in this conversation because I think there's so, that we both selected the stories of men in small towns and families and that time of just like heightened HIV hysteria. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This is a really wonderful conversation. I want to encourage everyone watching at home to click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen to buy a quilt for David from Charis. It really does help us when you buy your event books directly from us. I also want to let you know that because of supply chain demands and issues, the Prettiest Star is actually out of stock currently on our website. So I am linking to The Evening Hour, which is Carter's first book, which is available and is also in many ways about being queer and different in a small town. And so even though it's not quite as directly related to this conversation, if you somehow have missed his first book, it is just as wonderful. And we would encourage you to go back and read that one. And also, can you just say a little bit, Carter, about what the production possibility is or the distribution, I mean, about seeing the film for regular folks? Are we going to get to see the film?
Yeah, you actually can now. I'm going to start publicizing it, but it is available to rent on like Google and through iMovies, Amazon. But yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. Well, so everybody check that out. I will go rent it ASAP. I've been waiting, but I don't get invited to Sundance, so I've gotta wait until it's available for home distribution. But that's super awesome. But yes, definitely read the book first. And Stephen, thank you so much for this really interesting way to tell our histories. I mean, I really just am so excited about the creativity that you have brought, both in the rubbing project and in your poetry. I feel like this is a way to make our histories accessible to more people who are not going to read a regular history book. And so this feels really exciting to me, and I think it's going to feel exciting to a lot of people who were not alive during this time. So thank you for that creativity, and I look forward to new future things from you.
Thank you so much. And I just have to say, I absolutely love your bookstore. And I do want to suggest that everyone listening actually purchase through you. And City Lights, there are book plates that I don't know if you've received them yet. So when people purchase through your bookstore, there's a book plate. And I didn't want to just sign book plates. So on every book plate, I did a little drawing. So like, you know, which I'm so sorry that due to COVID that this isn't in person, but so people can buy signed copies through you, and that's the only place they can buy signed copies right now, with that book plate with my very rudimentary sketch. But yeah, I really hope that people continue to support you. You're such a great institution, and so many people are fortunate that you're around and still doing what you're doing. And it's been wonderful to be in conversation with Carter. Thanks for arranging that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, thank you both, and I hope you stay safe and well. And then, you know, in the future, we'll get to hang out in person.
I'd like that.
That would be great.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Have a good night.